breaks about as much as you guys do. So, okay, so
I'm trying to get through. I'm trying to get through the weekend.
Well, hopefully you guys. I feel like I intentionally slowed this class down a bit so you can focus on your other classes. Right? Hopefully that worked for you. Do you not feel that way?
Well, I'm doing your homework tonight and then your homework for a different class tomorrow. So.
Well, that's a different class though. So this one we really just got. You guys could be. You're eager beavers. You could even work ahead if you wanted to. But I understand. I wouldn't do it either. But in theory. All right. So today we are going to talk a little bit more about the crisis that has been faced by a lot of countries with these currency problems. So. Let me start today with kind of what we left off with last time, but getting that a little more formalized. So we were talking about issues with pegging. And so we had kind of three different scenarios. What were they in regard to exchange rate regimes? Fixed,
pure
float, and dirty float. So kind of a managed system. And so that's what we're looking at today is the issues that come about really with pegging. And we're going to go through the case of what's called a speculative attack on the currency that's happened in actually a number of countries over time. So for starters, the issue here is the central bank, CB, whatever the central bank is, must intervene with purchases or sales of international reserves. And kind of the special note here is that the US dollar has maintained its prominence as the international reserve currency. Is the international reserve currency by not by getting nominated it or something, but almost by kind of historical default here. So it's not that it could stay that way. It's not like there's an agreement that, hey, let's use the US dollar. It all really came about from the United States being the large player. About 50% of international global trade at the time Bretton Woods went on was with the US dollar. So when we started that system, post-World War II time frame, then the US dollar kind of was this anchor currency. And so from there, it's just been kind of historical accident, maybe not so much an accident because it was a little intentional at that time that it's remained the reserve currency. Okay, and what did we learn last time? We kind of went through the market. What's the big issue here with that system as far as the central bank is concerned and being able to continue to have a fixed currency?
Eventually, whenever your currency depreciates against the other by market forces, you're not going to be able to continue dumping out the other currencies and the other reserves.
Right. So the problem comes about when you have to supply currency you don't own or you can't make. And that's where the problem comes in. And you're right, it comes in with depreciation when the par value is essentially overvalued relative to where the market is for that period of time. So graphically what we did last time was in the exchange market, perhaps we're looking at quantity of pesos. We'll talk a little bit about Mexico Today they went through a currency crisis in the 90s. And so again, remember we're measuring pesos here. So up here we'd have what, dollars per peso or peso per dollar? Pesos per dollar. So we got pesos per dollar.
Yeah, that's why I put that.
Yep. Why?
Because we're measuring pesos.
We're measuring pesos. So one way to kind of just remember that is when you do the fraction, I thought I heard somebody say dollars per peso, that's why I wrote it up. Okay, so it's easy to get screwed up with this, and so that's why I'm trying to put back the logic. So if I want to buy a peso, what do I have to pay with? I got to pay with dollars, so it's dollars per peso. And once you kind of reason that out, it becomes pretty easy, I think, to put the right one on in the numerator. Okay, and one of the nice features of this is that the exchange rate now, if it goes up, it means appreciation of the currency you're measuring on the horizontal axis. So an upward direction means appreciation of the peso. A downward direction means depreciation of the peso. And so with this pegging exercise, we brought in the notation of par. So the exchange rate at par is the pegged amount that the central bank decided to do. All right. So let me leave that for now. Unless there's any questions. Does this look all right? And a little bit of review from the last thing we wrapped up last time. Okay, so speculative attacks. So, as the word sounds here, it is speculators, or currency speculators, they're investors. They probably specialize. So investors know that the central bank must devalue if it runs out of reserves. And it, or they can continue downward pressure and will, let's just use the word win, if central bank runs out.
Are you missing out in the first sentence?
I might be. Investors know that the central bank must devalue if it runs out of reserves. Thank you. All right, so let's back up one step and see how the central bank gets into trouble in the first place. So this happened in Thailand. So let's look at example Thailand in the 1990s. So they had pegged, so the baht is their currency. Let's just use a B. The Thai baht was pegged at 25 baht per dollar, which is 4 cents in terms of dollars per baht, just flipping that around. So the central bank's going about doing their business, maintaining this pegged amount. The other piece of information that was going on is the current interest rates. So that was one thing, one piece of data. The other piece of data is that current interest rates US about 7%, and the interest rates in Thailand were equal to about 11%. So, in terms of capital flows, we talked about how money in today's world tends to roam the globe. Where is it going to want to roam to? To Thailand, right? So we have that going on. And then internally within Thailand, since capital was free to roam around, some of their private banks got the idea of, well, hey, why let the foreign investors in? I can just borrow from the United States at 7% and do a little arbitrage deal, right? I can borrow at 7 and loan it out at 11. And that would be a pretty good idea for an aggressive bank. So, idea. Growing private Thai banks could borrow from US at 7% and loan out at 11% in Thailand. So that's a pretty good deal. We've got 7% interest in the United States, so we've got US 7%, and we got the private Thai banks over here. I don't want to make it look like a central bank, so I'm not sure how to privatize this thing. It's got a little friendly front door or something on it, I guess. So, private Thai banks. So they're going to borrow from the United States and loan out domestically at the 11%.
So you have a guaranteed 4% interest rate differential, and there's not going to be any change in the interest rate because they're not going to change the currency.
Yes. Yeah. So we get a 4% spread, and exchange rate is at par. Pretty sweet deal. Okay. So, as there starts to be, coming back to this picture, if we now change that, maybe I should draw the picture since I got patients there, not to confuse things. So let's just do quantity of baht here. And we got dollars per baht. And their current exchange rate was at 4 cents, remember, so we can just draw a good old supply and demand curve intersecting at that point. And that was our par rate. All right, so as the market starts to change, and let's put a little D2 here, as there starts to become pressure for the exchange rate to change to 2 through a decrease in demand, what does the foreign bank have to do? What does the Thai central bank have to do? Supply more dollars, right? So now they're starting to have to fund this decrease, right, to maintain par. So the currency wants to depreciate. Is that right? So we got two. It takes 1 baht one baht buys 4 cents, 1 baht buys 2 cents, right? So it's depreciation. The currency wants to depreciate. In order to maintain par, they start funding it and having to drain their reserves. Now, as the speculators start to kind of pile on, if they think that that this isn't sustainable any longer, they will keep the pressure on, and eventually they can make them break. And in 1997, that's what happened. So the picture kind of looked like this if we were measuring time. And here's 1997, and this is my .04, so I'm kind of just changing the dynamic here a little bit, putting the exchange rate over time. They were able to maintain that 25 baht per dollar, $4 per baht, and then in 1997 couldn't do it any longer. They ran out and had to devalue, and so that caused this, and then they went on to kind of a dirty float after that. So if you pull up a graph, it would look something along those lines. And what did it cause for this bank is the main thing that I wanted to think about here with the onset of a true financial crisis. What's going on with the bank's deal?
Even though they were originally making at 11%, now they have to pay back double of what they already.
Right. Yeah. So let's kind of work out the details. That's right. What's happening on their income statement? So if what's that? A lot of loss. Yeah, that's right. So if let's just assume here, if the 7% interest payment, 7% payment is $100, we could say $100,000, it doesn't really matter. You previously paid, I like to kind of just ground myself back to real dollars. You previously paid how much baht? If your payment to your U.S. lender was $100, your 7% turned out to be $100, 2,500 baht, right? So remember, you're a domestic Thai bank, so you're not you don't need dollars, you need baht to live your life or whatever. So 7% payment is $100. You previously paid 25 baht per dollar times the $100. If we kind of use this notation, I know it's kind of simplistic, but it helps my brain. 2,500 baht is what we were really converting that back to. So we've got 2,500 baht. Now what are we paying? 5,000, like overnight. And this is what happened in Switzerland here lately too, is that we had this extreme movement in the exchange rates where it got cut in half. So now you pay 5,000 baht. And how's your little scheme going on up here? What did we effectively raise this to? 14. I mean, it just straight out doubles it, right? Just like it goes from 7 to 14. Now I'm borrowing at 14, and I have long-term loans at 11. Now I'm underwater to the tune of 3%, and I'm broke. Financial crisis. Everything falling apart without a bailout of some sort. Go ahead.
I was going to ask if you knew what the Thai government did, if the financial institutions got pulled out, or if they were allowed to fail.
I don't know all of the details, but I think the IMF played a role with getting some loans to banks.
Which makes sense.
Yeah. And then that's where we start layering on, okay, the IMF might come out with a cheap loan to bail them out. If they kind of wipe out, imagine the IMF taking out one of these or helping them service the difference in the meantime. That's where we get into the bailout world, which might not come without strings attached to it. And so,
I'm sure that interest rate gain is no longer allowed to occur.
yeah. Now, I want to step back for a second and think, what was the real cause of the crisis? Yes. And then even, and why?
Because otherwise the exchange rate would have adjusted to the interest rate differences through interest rate parity that we learned on.
Yeah, yeah. So having that fixed caused there to be loans being made that otherwise maybe wouldn't have been made, right? And that's the key thing that happens with all of these things is we start to get that malinvestment that Hayek talked about through distorting things with the fixed exchange rate. When we have capital flows wanting to move one direction, but something being rigid, something has to give. And in this case, we start making loans to activities that might not otherwise. So, in fact, I didn't really even talk about that, is that there might have been loans to people who wouldn't otherwise have gotten a loan, is another thing.
This is kind of related, specifically on Bretton Woods, but also kind of a little bit on the gold standard. Isn't that more or less what the gold standard ends up being, is kind of a paid system, specifically under Bretton Woods? And so wouldn't this have basically occurred had Nixon not just decided to slam shut the gold window?
The problem with Bretton Woods was that they didn't force the U.S. government to keep fixed.
Right.
And so, and I don't quite understand the history of that, if it was like a whoops, we screwed up, or they intentionally did it that way. But it allowed the United States to pursue inflationary policy, and then that's what ultimately caused the rest of the system to fall apart. Because you're right, everybody else was kind of following this peg system, but then the United States was able to increase their money supply, and then that was not sustainable any longer.
Wouldn't that end up basically, if everybody was on a gold standard, wouldn't that more or less be what that is everyone's pegging to one thing of gold?
Yeah, then we're fixed to gold, and that's why the people who argue for gold standard are saying then we've wiped out all the discretionary policies of other banks.
That still have the same problems that an entire fixed system would have?
No, because of the only thing that causes it to fluctuate is the production and discovery of gold, which historically has been pretty stable. That's the difference. So with the Bretton Woods adjustment, then over time, Congress or the Federal Reserve, they started to inflate the economy. They weren't following a true fixed to gold standard. That's where the break happened. Is we let them have kind of the easier way out with that. It wasn't truly fixed. So if it is fixed to something stable, so we haven't talked about bitcoins, nor do I want to get too sidetracked at this point on bitcoins, but bitcoins is a mathematical expression that would essentially fix the number of currency out there. And it would be non-discretionary. It's a mathematical formula that keeps the money supply fixed. So the number of bitcoins that are floating around there is not subject to the discretion of anybody. It's really a true rule of law where it would be fixed.
But
you discover them that, and I've read a little booklet on it. It looks something like this. The number of bitcoins is a function to where once we're already like out that way. The amount of discovery that happens, which costs money too, you have to put computing power and all of that into it. It would be very, very little, according to the function, the way it works.
It's working basically off an exponential function.
Yeah, yep, and it has the diminishing returns, and we're already, I think, at that point where it gets pretty costly to discover more bitcoins. So anyway, that's the idea of fixing a currency to something. And gold kind of works too, although there has been fluctuations in the production and discovery of gold. As new innovations come out, you imagine if we can X-ray the earth and find huge deposits of gold somewhere, some technology comes along, that could cause a disturbance in gold. So in some ways, this is probably more reliable as a fixed amount. Okay, so the policy trilemma is the next thing that kind of highlights some of the issues that we've been looking at. So economists call it the policy trilemma. Instead of a dilemma, it's a trilemma because you can't have everything. Something's got to give. So policy trilemma. So draw yourself a little triangle. And at the points, we have some policy choices. At the top here, we'll put fixed exchange rate. To the left, we'll have free capital mobility. And off to the right, independent monetary policy. Okay. So, the United States has a fixed or floating system? Float. So it's not up here, it's down here. So the world that the United States chooses to live in is right here. So this is the United States. And so your textbook just calls this option 1. A country can choose option 1. The United States chooses to have free capital mobility. We can roam the globe for money. Money can come into the United States and out of the United States freely. And we have the central bank able to run things. China operates in this world, which I guess your book calls option 3. I'm going out of order. So they have historically fixed the yuan. It was originally fixed against the dollar, and then they abandoned that in 2005, and it's kind of fixed against a basket of currencies. They were catching some flack. I think it was around 8 yuan per dollar was the exchange rate. And so the old story that we've read a little bit in this book and others maybe is China kept the exchange rate fixed. They kept those Chinese goods cheap and kept us hooked on their crack, right? So we would keep buying their stuff. And so the value of the yuan actually wanted to appreciate. If we were looking at this and if we had the yuan here, in fact, it's kind of an interesting case to look at. Just to kind of, so we've got yuan, and we got dollars per yuan. Actually, I should be doing this the other way, but so they kept their exchange rate fixed low. People were buying Chinese goods. You remember from the shifters from chapter 20 that if we want to buy more Chinese goods, we need Chinese dollars, we need more yuan. That would normally lead to an increase in the demand for yuan, causing upward pressure and appreciation of the yuan. Chinese government didn't allow that to happen. So what did they have to do in terms of intervention?
They put more currency out on the market.
Yep, and so what are they acquiring? Dollars. And they have the largest holding of US dollars. So they were sucking up dollars throughout all the 90s and 2000s, holding this par. So this is sustainable for the central bank. They're just acquiring large amounts of reserves. Now in hindsight, what that really means is that they're stuck with a bunch of low interest rate stuff too, because they're holding US government bonds and other things that have a real low rate of return. It could be argued that wouldn't the Chinese be better off having inflows of capital to fund other investment to make that country a better place, right? Because it's kind of tied up in low risk, low interest stuff is one of the things that resulted from that. So eventually, another issue that came up with China is other countries wanting to erect trade barriers to say, hey, this isn't fair. You know, you're keeping your stuff too low and it's causing problems for us with maybe some of our domestic companies. And so they might start to erect trade barriers. And now that's a decent threat to China because that's part of the reason they're doing it in the first place is that they can keep trading. So they eventually conceded and started to allow the yuan to go up, to appreciate. And so that's where we're at today. There's some flexibility upward with the yuan. So more of a little bit of a dirty float, although theirs is very dirty. Okay, now over on number 2 here, we've got a place like Hong Kong. Hong Kong was the kind of the free market brainchild that Milton Friedman purported, and it's at the top of the list on the Economic Freedom Index. One of the reasons it ranks pretty high is what you're seeing here with the fixed exchange rate, right? So we've taken that out of any power for the central bank. So they're operating under a fixed exchange rate regime, but yet they allow free capital mobility. One thing I didn't comment on here with China is what they leave out, and that's this. So China has controls on how much inflow and possibly outflow. The government monitors that and kind of regulates the inflow and outflow of capital. So if you are a wealthy Chinese person, you might not be allowed to buy the high interest rate stuff over in Thailand. So they might not allow that to happen. Now, in the real world, those capital controls, empirical evidence shows that that's pretty limited in terms of how well that works. So the government says, oh, we're not going to allow that. You know, you have to show me your books. Okay, I just won't show you my books, right? And so somehow there's leakages or loopholes or all kinds of stuff when the government tries to limit capital flows. But they can, to some degree, they can be successful with not having capital flowing too fast in or out of the country. Okay, questions there on the trilemma? All right, I got a little video queued up here that talks about some of the IMF stuff. It's from an economist, Joe Stiglitz, who's a Nobel laureate, but I have some mixed feelings about old Joe. But the topic here is interesting and relevant to this chapter. In fact, this is new material that the chapter doesn't even really cover, but I think they give an interesting kind of overview of what the IMF is, as well as this new system of dealing with some of the issues that the IMF faces. So the International Monetary Fund, one of its knocks against it is that it's really the world powers that are kind of controlling a lot of what happens with that fund. You've got some losers, or at least losers that seem to be charged with loser-type stuff, like Strauss-Kahn. He was the guy that was charged with the rape of the maid in New York. That was kind of a big deal. He was looking to be the new French prime minister, to take out Sarkozy, and he kind of screwed up there, but he was heading up the IMF at the time. So anyway, this video kind of gives a little bit of history. It's just 7 minutes long, and we can talk about it.
Now.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, a group of 5 countries have launched their own development bank to challenge the United States-dominated World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Leaders from the so-called BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, unveiled the new development bank at a summit in Brazil.
This was just
The bank will be
2014,
headquartered in Shanghai. Chinese President Xi Jinping said the agreement would have far-reaching benefits for BRICS members and other developing nations.
在各方共同的努力下，
Through the concerted effort from all sides, we have managed to reach a consensus in the creation of the BRICS Development Bank today. This is the result of the significant implications and far reach of BRICS cooperation, and is therefore the political will of BRICS nations for common development. This will not only help increase the voice of BRICS nations in terms of international finance, but more importantly, will bring benefits to all the people in the BRICS countries and for all peoples in developing countries.
That was Chinese President Xi Jinping. Together, BRICS countries account for 25% of global GDP and 40% of the world's population. For more, we're joined now by Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, professor at Columbia University, author of numerous books. His new book is called Creating a Learning Society, a New Approach to Growth, Development, and Social Progress. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Talk about the significance of this bank.
Oh, it's very, very important in many ways. First, the need globally for more investment in the developing countries especially is in the order of magnitude of trillions, a couple $1 trillion a year. And the existing institutions just don't have enough resources. They have enough for 2, 3, 4%. So this is adding to the flow of money that will go to finance infrastructure, adaptation to climate change, all the needs that are so evident in the poorest countries. Secondly, it reflects a fundamental change in global economic and political power. That one of the ideas behind this is that the BRICS countries today are richer than the advanced countries were when the World Bank and IMF were founded. We're in a different world. At the same time, the world hasn't kept up. The old institutions have not kept up. You know, the G20 talked about and agreed on a change in the governance of the IMF and World Bank, which were set back in 1944. There have been some revisions. But the U.S. Congress refuses to follow along with the agreement. The administration failed to go along with what was widely understood as the basic notion that, you know, in the 21st century, the heads of these institutions should be chosen on the basis of merit, not just because you are an American. And yet, U.S. effectively reneged on that agreement. So this new institution reflects the disparity and the democratic deficiency in the global governance, and is trying to restart, to rethink that. Finally, there have been a lot of other changes in the global economy, and the new institution reflects the broader set of mandates, the new concerns, the new sets of instruments that can be used, the new financial instruments, and the broader governance, realizing the deficiencies in the old system of governance. Hopefully, this new institution will spur the existing institutions to reform, and that's what, you know, it's not just competition. It's really trying to get more resources to the developing countries in ways that are consistent with their interests and needs.
And the importance of countries like China, which obviously has huge monetary reserves, and Brazil, which had developed its own development bank now for several years, they're being key players in this new financial organization.
Very much. And that illustrates, as you say, a couple of interesting points. China has reserves in excess of $3 trillion. So one of the things is that it needs to use those reserves better than just putting them into U.S. Treasury bills. You know, my colleagues in China say that's like putting meat in a refrigerator and then pulling out the plug, because the real value of the money put in U.S. Treasury bills is declining. So they said we need better uses for those funds, certainly better uses than using those funds to build, say, shoddy homes in the middle of the Nevada desert. You know, they're real social needs, and those funds haven't been used for those purposes. At the same time, Brazil has the BNDES is a huge development bank, bigger than the World Bank. People don't realize this, but Brazil has actually shown how a single country can create a very effective development bank. So there's a learning going on, and this notion of how you create an effective development bank that actually promotes real development without all the conditionality and all the trappings around the old institutions is going to be an important part of the contribution that Brazil is going to make.
And how does that bank function differently, let's say, than other development banks in the north?
Well, we don't know yet because it's just getting started. The agreement, it's been several years underway. The discussions began about 3 years ago, and then they made a commitment, and then they've been working on it very steadily. What was big about this agreement was there was a little worry that there would be conflicts of the interest. Everybody wanted the headquarters, the president. Would there be enough political cohesion, solidarity to make a deal? Answer was there was. So what it was really saying is that in spite of all the differences, the emerging markets can work together in a way more effectively than some of the advanced countries can work together.
All right, so do you see any red flags with a situation like the BRICS?
From whose perspective of the United States?
Let me go to Michael.
I would say from whose perspective?
From the people's perspective, like real people that live in these countries.
That's what I'm saying.
Are you talking about people
In the BRICS. Oh, I'm sorry, in the BRICS.
In the BRICS?
Yeah, in the countries, yeah.
It's going to be good for them.
I mean, what you see with those 5 countries is that they currently, for example, China, more so than the others, at least in the U.S.'s case, holds a large portion of debt that's outside of those countries, and so they still have to interact with us, but they are kind of shutting themselves into more of a collaboration of these, highly developing, quickly developing countries, also trying to put a frontier for the less developed countries as well.
Who was it again? Brazil?
Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And actually, South Africa just recently joined that group because it was just the BRIC countries.
So, nobody's concerned about concentration of power?
I would say that I'd be concerned highly about the fact that the countries on that list, specifically the first 4, even South Africa to a certain extent, have some pretty egregious human rights records.
Yeah, their history hasn't been real good. In fact, current events aren't real good with number 2, right?
Or China for that matter, or Brazil, or India.
But as we've seen in our own history, you have rule of the majority, and if they've got 40% of the world's people, they're obviously going to have some of the world power. I mean,
yeah. So I'm back to the real people who live in these countries.
they don't have as much though.
Yeah. Is it an issue? Is it not?
I'm going to say they should be majority of these problems. They've got 25% of the world's GDP in that regard. So at that point, that's a large chunk of it. Don't get me wrong, but I wouldn't call that. I'd call that a building concern, because those are all, well, at least in China's case, that's as everyone says, the next big candidate to become another superpower.
Is this likely a move to more top-down policy or bottom-up policy?
top down?
Top-down, right? I think it's clearly a step in that direction anyway. And that, I told you that I don't agree with old Joe on some things. He's a bit more of a mainstream economist that has we can orchestrate things better. Let me use these resources and tell you how to shuffle them around to make society a better place, and kind of that top-down managed type basis. And so, so that would be kind of one of my concerns. Whenever I see stuff like that going on, it's different if it's voluntary organizations, but it's governments getting together and getting perhaps more power, or it just alarms me a little bit. Chelsea?
I was just going to say, I mean, if nothing else, it provides competition to the World Bank and the IMF, and that does allow more needs to be filled one way or another. And it allows countries in crisis that need to go to, or developing nations that are in need to be able to go to a couple different options. And I mean, from just a pure capitalism perspective, that's a good thing.
There's a bit of a presumption that those governments could do it better than whatever the IMF,
well, the
government-related people. Let me get somebody else to join in, John. Thank you.
They mentioned something about, it was, I think it was in the video, but straying away from the American leader. So is the Chinese, is like that president going to be the leader now? Because he seemed to be the spokesperson.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know a lot of details about it. I just, it's something that I found a little bit alarming. Like, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? I'm not saying the IMF is necessarily a good thing, but at least some of the fundamentals, if there's going to be a bailout, I think the problem with the IMF is that they haven't been credible. This is some stuff you'll see in your reading about the IMF, but the IMF hasn't always been credible over the years on letting countries fail, or they say you got to do this, this, and this, and like kind of like a little kid, then they don't do it, and then like, oh, I suppose we'll let it go this time because it's harder to deal with the issue than it is to hold firm. So, any other last comments?
Isn't Brazil about to go bankrupt themselves?
Yeah, I don't know. That's it. Kind of surprised me too. You did your thing on Brazil.
Yeah, I just hear a lot still about how they're preparing for the World Cup.
Yeah,
and they should be investing in infrastructure.
Right.
Giving in millions.
That seemed to be a huge top-down type example.
What you see with all of those, I mean, it is interesting
because they
where
don't have the money to do it, but they're just investing so much in all the venues.
Right, banking on hope, kind of. That's
what you see. Sorry.
Let me go to Mike behind.
I was just going to say, with all those 5 countries, in China, kind of even with Hong Kong, where that's kind of like pseudo, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, they were. Go ahead.
You've got all 5 of those that have very, like, the United States. Yes, we have our kind of social stratification, and those 5 have even a higher gap between the top and the low.
Yeah, and income inequality might be something I'll touch on a little bit more. I listened to an interesting talk at the last conference I was at, and he predicted we shouldn't expect income inequality to really be that much better over the next 40 years, but people will be happier. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll tell you what he brought to the table on that.
Well, like inequality is not always the problem. It's like the segregation more than inequality. Yep.